closing opposition, post 5. Um, just write it in chat box. I'll definitely take. I also have a bad throat, so I might cough quite sometimes. Um, Starting speech in three, two, one. By the start of my speech, I just want to contextualize this debate. I think within status quo, there are multiple other narratives like capitalism or like just the desire to become more rich or desire to gain more power. All these things exist within the status quo already. That means even if you vilify this envy, I'm not sure why individuals don't have these emotions or feelings to go ahead and become more powerful or don't have emotions of greed. The second thing I want to do is that what exactly is this envy? We think this envy is not like you going ahead and like thinking that someone else is bad because someone else is bad because he got certain things because of luck, or you got certain things because of your family or your parents, or you got something from your hierarchy or something like that. We think this envy is something that is drawn from comparisons within society. This looks like you going ahead and comparing whatever you have or whatever you don't have within the society. This being the setup, I have a couple of things within my speech. The first thing I want to talk about is what happens when you vilify this envy, and why can't individuals control it. The reason envy is vilified within the society is that envy, envy comes within yourself, or like you draw these comparisons. That does not mean like you can actually control this, or this is something that is or it can't be controlled. This the problem that essentially exists is that it is a biological mechanism. That means regardless of what kind of vilification you do, individuals inherently have this tendency to go ahead and feel envy or just to compare themselves with other individuals, and that is something that is important. The reason this is important is because of a couple of things. The first reason this is important is that if you vilify envy, then certain individuals within the status quo are unable to go ahead and are unable to go ahead and express themselves, that okay, that they are not able to go ahead and perform certain activities or like just be more progressive in general. At that point in time, it becomes significantly difficult for these individuals to express themselves as to what how exactly are they feeling, because they literally don't have control on these kind of emotions. I think with this setup, I have two things in my speech. The first thing I have is why individuals feel that they are inferior, and second, on why you have more self growth or rehabilitation on ourselves. The first thing that I want to prove is that the moment at which you start comparing, you're unable to compare yourself, but this vilification exists in status quo. You at all point in time are expected to go ahead and not talk about these things to people around you. You think that this narrative like set up by the upper class individuals, or like this narrative set up by people who are already in power, are always going to make you feel that you are inferior at that point. That means the comparative then becomes on their side, on opposition side of the house. You essentially have to expect other individuals or like society control how you feel about yourself. Our side of the house, you actually have chances of expressing this envy in the status quo. What exactly is the mechanism, and how exactly do you feel good on our side of the house? I think there are a couple of things. The first thing is the moment at which this vilification does not exist, you at all point in time start talking to individuals. You at all point in time start engaging in conversations. I note the conversation might not be the tipping point in this round, or like this does not mean that you are going to become like very good, or like you're going to engage in activities that are better for you or going to have a better future. No, activity of engaging in conversations or activity of realizing that you are actually not inferior, or you're actually there are certain things are not arbitrary in nature, and like hard working can actually give you some utility. At that point in time, you identify some self esteem within yourself. Note, this is the first impact that we draw on opening government, that individuals in on comparative have more self esteem and they just feel better about themselves. The second thing I want to run on opening government is that how it gives individuals chance or like capacity to go ahead and like do more rehabilitation or grow, or like more growth. Before that, closing opposition, do you have anything?
Yeah, hate is vilified, yet I can still hate you. Why is vilification necessarily equal to not being able to express yourself?
Because people are going to judge you. I'm not sure why that is important, because consistently people are going to judge you and you are going to be hated by society. I think this hate by society is the reason why you're going to be restricted within yourself and you feel inferior. That was my entire mechanism. The second constructive that I want to run as to why individuals opt for more rehabilitation and self growth on our side of the house is simple. Note, precursor to identifying the problems within yourself, or the precursor to change, is understanding the emotion that you have within yourself. So note that in status quo, when individuals are unable to go ahead and get success, or they are feeling either envy with a lot of individuals, at that point in time, these emotions that are existing within yourself are like oppressed by the vilification of the society. That means, on comparative, you're unable to get these emotions outside of yourself. That means the problem then becomes is that you are unable to identify how to get these emotions out, or how to solve these emotions, or how can you go ahead and change yourself. That means this oppression puts a lot of expectations upon you, and hence you can't really change. The way we change on our side of the house, and the way this vilification changes, is a couple of things. Firstly, the moment at which you vilify that, I think you unlock a lot of things, or you unlock a lot of discourse. That means the conclusion of this then becomes is that you start engaging in conversation, and you start prioritizing certain short-term goals. So even if society is vilifying you, or even if society is saying that these things are something that is bad, or you should not follow someone, or you should not compare yourself, I think individuals' capacity to form certain short-term goals significantly increases. That means there are multiple impact of this. I think the first impact is that you in general more self-confident, and you think that you can actually achieve something which on comparative, when it is vilified by society, is the illusion that only inherited wealth is something that can be earned, or so luck is the most important factor. It means the self-confidence that you gain pushes you to go ahead and like reach for more pushes you to go ahead and reach for more long-term goals. That means the exclusive impact we draw is that individuals feel more motivated. Let's just weigh this really quick. We think that individuals feel really vulnerable when this is vilified, because individuals' capacity to make decisions for themselves is extremely reduced. That means, on comparative, the moment at which you give self confidence to these individuals, we think we change two specific things within the status quo. The first thing we change is that more individuals push themselves to the extreme and do better hard work. Second, I think this emotion being oppressed, or like pressed within yourself, is something that causes harm to individuals. We unlock this harm, and individuals feel more free. For all those reasons, opening government.
Thank you, Prime Minister, following up on the obsession here.
Amazing. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep, audible and visible.
Excellent. Really want to quickly answer one thing about opening government's case, which is whether or not you're in control of your emotions and whether or not you can help being envious. This is probably not something you can control at a very minimal level. Obviously, people are to some level culpable for their emotions and have some level of control over their mental state. If this was not the case, it would be horrible to tell anybody that they should stop like lusting over women creepily because, well, they just couldn't be in control of their emotions. It would be impossible to condemn anybody for being racist because they're not in control of their emotions. So I think obviously a significant premise of opening government's material is wrong if you just consider the way in which most people vilify motivations. It is not to vilify the mere presence of the motivation whatsoever in a very minimal capacity, but whether or not someone festers that emotion and somebody retains it over a long period of time, not attempting to do anything about it, not attempting to think about it, go to therapy, try and like find a healthy outlet for whatever kind of emotion. The first question I want to answer is how vilification manifests in society. Then I'll get through the constructive case because everything is downstream from this. I think if opening opposition proves this very firmly, we have to win the debate. How do the vilification of certain emotional sentiments evolve and manifest in society? Generally, through a few ways, through like religious stories and religious texts, which inform the morality of many societies that tell these kind of acts are prohibited and wrong, through things like children's fables and general media which say these are stories about people who felt certain envious attitudes and describe the attitudes they had as parables of how not to be and what not to be like. right? And obviously, there's going to be, we could imagine instances of vilification which go too far and instances of vilification that are very, very sensible and reasonable. Why do I think it's the case that the majority of vilification narratives trend towards good? The first reason is that they have to vie for attention within a market of attention, right? So if these vilification narratives are far too demanding and paint the vast majority of people to be morally wrong, then not a significant number of people are going to buy into it, right? And so people will trend throughout sort of centuries of moral evolution of the species. People will trend towards a narrative that paints vilification of emotions as something that they can reasonably absolve. This is why, like, generally the moral intuitions we have are quite doable and are not like absolutely insane and something that paints every single person within a society as wrong. The second reason I think this is true is that a very small number of society are rich elites. Generally, if you think about how Christianity has sort of evolved, it was a religion of like the broad masses of very poor people, similar to how people share sort of fables of morality within their villages or within their communities, teaching certain moral values to their children. So this means that from a demographics perspective, the vast majority of people engaging in moral discourse are people who are not exceptionally wealthy. So all this is to say that I think from this framing, you can believe a couple of things. The first is that most people believe in a vilification of envy that does not, for instance, paint the majority of people as horrible for simply being born poor, but does encourage them to do a few specific things and live sort of lives that are somewhat better. How then does vilifying envy make the world a significantly better place? This is going to be the constructive case then. The first reason for this, our first contention, is that it discourages people from dwelling on things that will make them certainly miserable. The sort of classical phrase for this is that, like, comparison's the death of contentment, right? If you overwhelmingly spend an amount of time on things that are outside of your control, that's the surest way to make yourself miserable, right? To constantly dwell on the fact that you're much shorter than other men, or that you're incredibly sort of you're kind of dumb compared to other people, that you have a very ugly looking face, that you were born exceptionally poor or of a racialized minority. Dwelling on these kinds of things does not actually make you happier. It does the exact opposite. It emphasizes just how little is within your control and just how much in life is outside of your hands. I think any narrative that encourages people, that is in this case vilification, that says it's wrong for you to seriously focus and spend a lot of time on things other people have, whether or not they earned them, encourages you to focus on the things that are unique to you and the things that will make you happy and the things that are within your control. Right? You need some sort of moral push in order to focus against things that will make you miserable. I think that's relatively sensible. And obviously, opening government says to some extent, well, you should work harder and become like the people you envy. But just think logically, the overwhelming number of people cannot be within the percentage of people who are enviable, right? Not everybody can be a billionaire. And if they were, then the thing to envy would be a trillionaire, right? And vice versa with any single other type of trait or quality someone could possess. So the point is here that absent some disincentive for people to envy others, a substantial number of people are likely to make themselves miserable by focusing on things outside of their control. Closing government.
This all seems like an argument for people not to pity themselves, not an argument against envy. As your introduction itself explains, the emotion is fine, it's consequence that stems from it that's not.
Yeah. The point is that the way in which most people interact with this vilification is likely to say that the root cause of the emotion is fine, but the way in which it manifests in its vilification is not fine. Like, we mechanized why this is the way in which most people interact with it. And so I think it's fair enough for us to say that. I think you can call it pity, you can call it envy. I think these emotions are very clearly linked with each other. The second argument I want to push here is that this discourages people from engaging in actions that are very bad, right? Think about how racist sentiments lead and develop into racist actions in the future, right? There's a significant number of things that if people remain very, very envious, they're likely to do, like robbing other people, like engaging in violence against the people who are the target of their envy. You can just look at the kinds of crimes a lot of people commit against richer people in their neighborhoods, that a lot of men will commit towards women, like incel type attacks. Obviously, I think these are really, really bad. And I think if you can encourage people to not engage in a cycle of envy and sort of go down that path line, you can often prevent them from moving to the point in which they start to engage in those actions. So even if those actions are vilified, we preemptively vilify the emotion which leads to the action, which means you get less of them.
Thank you. Thank you, leader of opposition, following up on DPM here.
Hi, can I be heard?
Go on with it.
I'll take one from closing. I'll start on my first word. Just a second. Drink some water. Yes.
Your order, bro. Whenever you're ready.
Start on my first word. I'll win the manifestation clash, and that automatically resolves the half. But a couple of things that opening opposition says that don't make sense. The first thing they try to do is to control the way in which this vilification happens by making it more applicable to people. But the metaphor they get for here is to just say that if it is extreme, more people opt out. Except the problem is this isn't prior to them opting in the first place, which is to say, it's not that you opt into Christianity because you like Christian values, but you end up liking Christian values because you're already in Christianity. I want you to gut check this. Most people are born in different areas, in different cultures, and that's where their religions start to form in, and that's the religion they take place in. Which is to say, most people are born in a social setting and they have to adhere to the social setting that already exists within these places in the first place. Why do these narratives in the initial phase start off as bad? Because notice the people who benefit and the people who control these narratives in the first place. And this wins the manifestation clash here. Because opening opposition says that vilification has to apply to most people because most people can engage in moral discourse. Except there are a lot of problems here. The first problem is the people who control the moral discourse and decide what morality is the people who claim to be messengers of God and are people who actually have any control over how morality is viewed in the first place. The problem then becomes that church is often funded by people at the top in the first place, which is to say, initially these narratives were that wanting to be a king as a commoner or wanting to dethrone the king and wanting the king's riches is something that's bad because king actually is God sanctioned in the first place. That actually led most of people had to resort to giving into that narrative because the other narratives are that if you don't follow this, you're going to hell, but also because of how indoctrination works. Notice that this is a sliding scale of examples, right? Most people think that being gay is bad, not because they have problems with being gay, but because their religion tells them to be gay and not to be gay in the first place, which is just to say that irrational beliefs are often accepted by people at the ground because they are afraid of other narratives which send them to hell in the first place and the social setting they were born with. Why does this win the manifestation clash? Because notice that most of opening opposition's problems are then settled at this, because everything that they say is that vilifying envy is something that's good because it happens in a good way and it stops people from wallowing in their self-pity necessarily is a contingent on them being able to prove that this is actually something that stops self-pity in the first place. What then does these narratives usually manifest us? I want to do two things here. One, I've already proven why people at top are in control of the narratives because they're the most powerful. But secondly, these people can opt out of these narratives as well because the backlash of these narratives can just be traded off by how rich they are. Which is to say, at top, I don't care because I have a good life. Which is to say, even if envy is vilified, I personally don't care, don't give a fuck at all. But secondly, they say that vilifying emotions is good because it preemptively vilifies actions. Except the problem is that this intuition doesn't make sense at all. You don't like go ahead and like jail people for thought crimes because the way they are thought crimes. Because necessarily note that we think that humans in most cases are able to rationalize, which is to say that probably they're going to like most people can necessarily differentiate actions from thoughts, which is to say that you can still go ahead and think that lust is something that's fine because it's biological, but still go ahead and like talk about why like consent is extremely important in the first place. But necessarily no. What then is OJ's extension and why exactly do we win? Notice I want to clash with opening opposition here directly. Opening opposition further says that this manifests in people not self-valuing. We already have competing material that I'll weigh here, which necessarily proves why this leads to more self-valuing. Notice their only material is that once you vilify this, you send this away and you at least decrease it. The problem with this is simple. A, it's biological, which is to say, evolutionary pressures force you to compare yourself with somebody else because otherwise you would never move up top of the hierarchy and thus you wouldn't survive in a society, which is why it's biologically linked to your neural mechanisms, which is to say, through your neural mechanisms, which is not in your control ever, even if vilification happens, you cannot stop the thoughts of envy in the first place. What then do these thoughts manifest as an op? Notice that once these thoughts manifest but are suppressed, which is to say you can't go ahead and talk about it, what then happens is that it manifests in a way that uh, leads to internalization. Notice that this is a sliding scale again with every other narrative. Notice that most people who are who are gay also internalize this being bad because they can't talk about it, they can't ever control it. Most religious gay people internalize these things. But notice this also happens here because at a point in time where envy is a biological feeling, which means that you necessarily go ahead and like always feel envy, what happens is that you think that I am committing a sin because your religion tells you you're committing a sin. As far as that happens, you internalize it and it manifests as self-esteem issues in the first place. What do these self-esteem issues look like? I am somebody who's inferior and still always competing with people who were chosen by God and shit like that because of luck. But notice this luck isn't something that's actually luck. It's a social institutions forcing communities to be differently developed than each other. Which is to say, this is where OJ's second impact also unlocks, and I'll impact this further. Before that, CO.
Alcoholism is also taboo. Why don't we just make
Yeah, murder
alcoholism?
is also taboo. Murder is also taboo. Being gay is also taboo. The problem with this is that just because society vilifies something doesn't make it inherently good. I've already proven why envy is something that's vilified by people up top because they want to remain in power and they want to have unequal growth in the first place. Which is to say, sure, growth still happens on their side of the house. Social movements still exist on their side of the house, but their capacity is extremely hindered. Why? Because notice, whenever growth happens, we talk about how trickle down happens, which is just to say that people at the top benefit massively more and people at the bottom are just supposed to accept that benefit in the first place. Why does this happen? Because notice, whenever you actually go ahead and try to create change in the first place, the first prerequisite to that is to want change and to be able to express change. Most people on their side of the house are afraid of expressing the want to have change in the first place, are afraid of accepting the want that they want to be as good as the rich and as rich as the people at top in the first place. Which is to say, you're envious of the businessman next door, but you don't talk about it because it's something that means that you're valuing in self-pity. All of this means that your ability to actually conceptualize your growth extremely reduces. Why is this the most winning material in this debate? Because notice, social movements become a lot better on our side of the house when more people are able to actually express the fact that they want this growth in the first place. Because notice, the narrative is controlled by up top. The people at bottom are preordained from ever opting into the other form of the narrative, which is just to say that I want to be as good as him as well. All of this simply means that yeah, you get more change on our side of the house. Proud to be at opening government. Weigh this on scale of change.
All right. Thank you, DPM. Following up on deputy leader obsession. Here.
Am I audible?
Yep, audible and
Okay. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think insofar that a lot of OG's case is dependent on their explanation that, oh, this manifestation of this narrative is on people that like have a lot of power because they have a lot of power, which leads to like all of their negative parts. I think we're able to win this case just by explaining, like my LO has did, about how it is that this happens, right? I think we at least give you maths on why very likely this type of manifestation is not going to be like, oh, is not something that is going to be extremely negative and telling you that like everyone is like super shitty and you have to become like the most like zen person in the world to do it. I just think this is very hard for people to buy in, whether or not you're in a religion, right? Even if it's like other narratives like social media, like your parents just telling you that like probably you should not say things like, I really hate this person. Why does this person have these things when I do not? And like when your parents tell you that like this is probably like really bad, you should not sing, you should not like hate someone because of this. You should not hate and like ask for their like possessions. You should probably go like try to do it yourself, try to learn the stuff yourself. I think in conclusion, a lot of times, even when it is like dropped down by people by social media, it's made in an accessible way as we have met, but also a lot of times this just happens in general in around you, how this narrative actually manifests with people telling you like this is morally right or wrong without really having something like, oh yeah, the richest people, like I don't know, a few centuries ago that say that like if you're of noble blood, then you cannot like if you're like a commoner, you can like convey what like someone who is noble really want. I don't think this is like really part of the debate. Okay then. So what is actually their case, right? I think we can go into this by saying that one, what does envy actually look like? I think this debate is not about like the vilification of all emotion. I think insofar that we're able to explain that that the vilification of envy as emotion is really good, we're able to win this debate. Meaning that envy is a feeling of longing, aroused by someone else's possession, qualities, or luck. This looks like I should feel really unhappy about everyone who is in an okay time zone right now and not awake since 2 a.m. and not having missed the breaks, so that like I only had 4 minutes to prep for this speech. I think all of this envy is just like a really bad this is not contingent to me, as like OG has stated. This envy is not contingent for me to wanting to become like to wanting to still like do good in this speech, right? I feel like then what OG tells us about is that one, when you envy and stress, like you aren't unable to control it. This is a biological mechanism. Like, sure, I guess like some people do feel like envy about like when they see that someone is better. I don't think that like not being able to express your hate for people who were born with a silver spoon, or not being able to express your hate about like how life is like super shitty and how the other people are super good is actually a good cope mechanisms to make people actually feel better, right? I think then the moment then they go on by saying like the moment that you're unable to compare yourself, the narrative makes you feel like shit. You expect like society to control how you feel about yourself. I think the most likely reasoning that this like envy is bad, so you probably shouldn't go about and say like how you hate other people. I think this is pretty good. I think this then, by saying that envy is bad, by making people like dissuading people from actually saying these stuff, you're able to make people actually concentrate on things that they can improve and actually getting what my LO is talking about. You're like, you can start a conversation. You can talk about how much you hate other people for things that you can't control. You can I just don't see in general how like offloading on other people and like bringing everyone like say hating everyone is actually going to make you feel more self-esteem, make you feel more confident in yourself, right? I think if I can tell myself that like I want to become better at debate for internal reason because I like this sport, because of all of this, I don't really need envy to have my self-esteem, to have my confidence by saying like, oh, why are these people so much better than me? And I don't have to like vocalize this to actually want to become better, to actually want to change myself. I probably can, if I do feel envy for these people, it's better for me to not like tell this to like the whole world, to not tell this in a recorded round, and like make and just in general self-pity myself, feel like my envy is like super justified, and then just like wallow in self-pity. I think like this goes on to like how CG talks, right? CG just tells us as the POI, it's like, oh yeah, this looks like a thing on pity. I will take it. Sure, yeah.
So, you identify that sometimes envy can lead to negative downstream consequences like pity or becoming an incel, but doesn't that concede that it can also lead to positive consequences like motivation or a desire for social change?
I think the problem here is that envy, guys, look, if you go on saying hate speeches about people, I think actually, how the hell do you want to get good social changes from like envy, right? I feel like probably if you say that like there's things that are bad in the world, there are people who aren't able to access good stuff in the world, I think a lot of people can agree to that. I don't think this is actually based on envy. This is probably based on like discrimination is not good. You should not discriminate people. You should probably give like better stuff to other people. I think like a lot of other narratives who are much more positive are actually directly impacting things like social change, things like your own personal internal change. I think a lot of times envy is much more of a bad way to access this. I think if we're able to vilify this, we are able to like take away the bad things that actually happens. I think that just like the CG stuff on like the semantics of, oh, is this pity, is this like envy? Probably you have to pity yourself to be able to and to be able to feel envy for someone. I also think in general, like our whole case still manages. So proud to you both.
Thank you, Diallo. Just a note to speakers, if per se 2 teams are raising a POI, please clarify which team's POI you're taking, just to make things a bit clearer. Member of government, whenever you're ready.
Just confirming I'm audible.
Yep, audible on this one.
All right, very good. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The problem with opening opposition is they hang their hat on the idea that vilification only punishes the worst, most unproductive forms of envy. Even if you believe that interpretation is fair, and even if you believe that that specific nuanced iteration of the narrative exists in the abstract, the problem is that they never prove that that is the precise version of the narrative internalized by the average person. 3 contributions from closing government. First, we will explain why the vilification of envy is internalized by people in a way that is excessively punishing. Secondly, we will explain why opening opposition's desired narrative of accepting some envy in moderation is in fact the counterfactual we support, co-opting their benefits. And lastly, we'll explain that independent of that frame, a vilification always inherently pushes people to suppress their sense of envy, which is what precisely allows envy to fester. And the comparative is a world where people can channel their sense of envy in productive ways. For instance, social movements in driving change, in pushing minorities and people to have experienced injustice to push for greater rights and better treatment. First, extension. Why is vilification internalized in ways that are excessively punishing? I want to note that, first of all, the Infoslide invalidates opening opposition's reading of the motion, because if you look at what the motion says, it says that envy is a feeling and an emotion, which means that this debate is about vilifying the initial emotion. It's not about vilifying the downstream implications of that emotion and its consequences in unproductive behavior. But I'm going to be charitable. Even if you believe that opening opposition's read of the debate is plausible, they're never content with who writes the narrative and how it's propagated. In terms of who writes the narrative, Our opening are correct to identify that the wealthy and powerful control the narrative. The problem is they never explain why they have an incentive to construct the norm in a way that is punishing, nor do they explain why they have the capacity to do so, which means that they are unable to beat opening opposition's plausible characterization, which is that this norm exists in the marketplace of ideas, and generally it's the ideas that make people feel good that win out. Why is it that they have the incentive and capacity? Firstly, in terms of incentive, we would note that envy is not just wanting something that someone else has. It's also wanting something that someone else has, and the idea that it is unfair that they have that thing and that you don't. It's that feeling of unfairness. It's that feeling of discrimination. And that's quite important because in response to that perceived sense of unfairness, the powerful have an incentive to vilify envy because they have an incentive to shut down any discourse that suggests that what they have is something that was unfair and therefore not right, that they should exclusively have access to wealth, access to power, which is why they have an incentive to write the narrative in a way that is excessively punishing. But secondly, in terms of why they have the capacity to do so, opening opposition says, well, the rich were always a minority in society. Yes, but they disproportionately had outsized influence on the media, on power structures, on religion. So it's clear that even though they were a minority in size, they had the maximal terms in terms of power, which is why they had the ability to spread the narrative in that way. Lastly, in terms of how the message is propagated, even if you believe that the message is initially nuanced, they have never explained why their instruments of enforcing a narrative are precise enough to enforce that nuanced narrative. We would say that things like social adjustment, shame, are just two blunt instruments, which means that people do not internalize the kind of kind, moderate, attenuated version of opening opposition's narrative. They instead internalize the idea that they should be vilified when they just feel the initial twinge of envy. That's how people feel it. They are preemptively afraid of being vilified, which means that people feel vilified or fear feeling vilified from the initial sense of envy, which is why vilification is excessively punishing. Secondly, then, on the counterfactual. Why is counterfactual one where envy is considered in moderation, which co-opts, I guess, all of opening opposition's case? The first thing to say is that envy is actually not innately harmful, right? Like, it's just the idea that you desire something that someone else has. And also sometimes it's legitimate. Like, it's the idea that you desire something someone has, and it's the idea that they stole it from you or that it's unfair that they exclusively have access to it. So the fact that it is at very least sometimes justifiable means that vilification is always inherently disproportionate because it's not inherently bad. And that's why it's likely that in the alternative narrative is one where vilification in moderation is good, or envy in moderation is good. But secondly, we would note that social norms are generally pro-social, which means they always have an incentive to curb the worst excesses of envious behavior to the extent that it encourages self-interest to the detriment of others, which is why it's likely to be a narrative that encourages envy in moderation. So, last extension, this will be the meat of it, explaining why vilification always results in suppression of envy, which precisely allows it to fester, again co-opting opening opposition. Before that, I'm happy to take OO. CO.
How can society hate an emotion that is subjective like envy?
What do you mean? So I just do not understand. Like, it's not subjective, right? Like it's, I guess, subjective in the sense of who it's applied to, but often the wealthy find it to be unfair because they don't want to, they don't think it's fair. They think it's totally fair that they get to have, which is why they get to judge it in that way. So why is vilification always suppress envy? Two reasons. Firstly, because vilification is a form of negative reinforcement, which at best incentivizes people not to do the undesirable behavior, rather than learn to the productive behavior to do the right thing. Which is to say that people learn from vilification to not be envious, to not show envy, rather than actually learn how to deal with it productively. But secondly, it's because people generally resist the idea that they're a bad person, which means that when they are confronted with an envious thought, rather than accept the fact that having that envious thought means they're a bad person, they just shut down that thought to begin with, which means that people never actually come to grapple with their sense of envy. They just bottle it in, which is precisely what allows it to fester. What is the upshot of that? It means, firstly, people do not actually genuinely internalize the vilification in opening opposition as well. They just internalize the idea that it's not bad, it's not acceptable to show, and therefore they should just not show it rather than actually confront it. And secondly, it certainly means that people do not channel envy in productive ways. On the comparative, people can channel envy when people deem it to be acceptable in moderation, because that means people are more likely to speak out upon it, and also means that people are able to channel in productive ways. A key example of this is that often envy and the emotion is crucial. It's a driving force for social change. Look at social movements like Occupy Wall Street to say, we are the 99%, we want what the 1% has. Or it's things like the civil rights movement, where African Americans said, we want basic rights. We want what the white man gets for granted. That is narratives that are easily motivated when the initial energy is a sense of envy, is the idea that it's unfair that people have things that you have. That is precisely why it's a very compelling and powerful narrative to channel social movements from. The comparative that Opbench has to defend is a world where that envy is depressed. It's a world where that envy is told is unacceptable. It tells people to deny the source of that unfairness. It doesn't exist. It's you're overthinking it. Or, at worst, it's to accept that unfairness as something inevitable, which is what paralyzes social change. For those reasons, we're proud to propose.
Thank you, Member of Government. Following up on Member of Opposition here.
Hi, Aditya, going member. Oh, just please sit in 30 seconds. I need to grab a glass of water. See this. All right, cool. I'm back. Thank you for waiting. Aditya, going member of no gender, no preferred gender pronouns, no specific POI preferences. Just drop it in the chat. I'll try to take on from you.
Would you like speak a bit louder if that's okay?
Yeah, sure. I'll please speak louder.
Sounds good.
Aditya, you're
All right.
also unmuted on Discord.
Yeah, wait, I'll mute that. Just a second. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. I'll do two things for you in my speech. Firstly, I'll tell you how power structures get worse on their side. And secondly, I'll tell you why general satisfaction is higher on our side. But before I proceed any further, two responses specifically to CG. CG tells you that, look, envy is going to be internalized, this hate for envy is going to be internalized by people. Panel, simply put, a rational person is aware of media narratives, is aware of religious narratives. They understand that, like, look, just because a religious book is saying something, just because a TV show is saying something, doesn't mean that I have to take it at face value, doesn't mean that I have to internalize it, doesn't mean that I have to ruin my entire life because of this one particular thing that one TV show, one character said, right? Secondly, understand the fact that you cannot hate on an emotion, right? Panel, intuition pump, simple. Do you hate hate? No, you hate the way hate makes you feel. You hate the way hate makes you have weird thoughts. You hate the way hate makes you act. It is the actions that a particular emotion inspires that you hate. You cannot hate an emotion, right? You hate the manifestations of a particular emotion. You hate the thoughts that emotion leads you to have. With that being said, coming on to some character, right? Understand that then any sort of vilification of envy or vilification of any emotion for that matter looks like vilification of extreme actions caused as a result of that emotion and not that emotion in itself. And note that these actions have to be extreme in order for them to be depicted as something that is negative, which means that in any sort of religious book you see that the vilification is on a person who murders, vilification is on a person who causes actual physical harm or actual mental harm. Even in fucking TV shows, you see that vilification is of actions which are extreme, actions which are just considered immoral by society as a whole. You don't see the vilification of like fucking gossiping, right? You see that as a normal human emotion, right? You see envy being expressed as a normal human emotion, right? Just to like give an example to this, all of us have watched Friends, right? And so the entire sort of Ross and Rachel fight happens because he's envious, right? And he's envious and he expresses that envy in the worst possible way. He becomes obsessed with it and he expresses it in the worst possible way. Not Ross is not vilified for having this emotion. In fact, you see a lot of characters in that show having that emotion and they're not vilified for it at all. It is the manifestation of that emotion, and it is the manifestation of the extreme actions of that emotion that is vilified, right? Small actions, like simply put, small actions like hating somebody for like, or being envious of somebody for like having a silver spoon when you do not, is like the most common movie trope ever, right? How are small actions vilified, panel? If you can give me like even one example of like small actions like gossiping, etc., being vilified, I'll accept defeat right now, right? Finally, then moving on, understand that
Why?
envy, like any emotion, is a spectrum. I'll take you later. Envy, like any emotion, is a spectrum, right? Which means that on the lower end it looks like motivation, and on motivation without malice, and on the higher end it looks like people actually taking like actions which can be very very negative, right? Which means that then normal societal structures already have this sort of like already enforce this sort of like moral code, right? Which means that any sort of like lower level human emotion, or if I'm like, just because I'm feeling slightly sad, does not mean that I'm going to actually go ahead and like commit actual crimes, right? Just for the sake of like me feeling slightly happier. Simply put, this moral code exists in like most rational human beings, and lower and emotions are like a very, very small emotions, or very less impactful emotions cannot overpower that. So then the only way that like your emotions can make you sort of break this societal code
Information.
is when you experience a large amount of this emotion, right? Which means that at any point in time, you see the most extreme manifestations of envy go ahead and like sort of make people act this way, right? Which means that like only and only when I am like seen as somebody who's like extreme, if I only and only when I get extremely envious of somebody or something, only then will I go ahead and like sort of only then will I go ahead and like sort of commit actual crimes, or like actually like sabotage somebody, right? Which means that at the end of the day, once you have this sort of like vilification narrative, we buy whatever government says that like, look, envy can sort of make you want to like act, or make you sort of like motivate you to become a better version of yourself, sort of like motivate you to go after things that you did not think that you
Why
need,
also?
etc., etc. We agree with all of that. I'll take you later. We agree with all of that, which is why we say that once you sort of have this vilification as a narrative existing in society, right, you are then encouraged to go ahead and check whenever you feel especially envious, right? That is to say, when I'm feeling incredibly envious, I'm going to see in like media narratives that look, people who get extremely envious actually make and like end up making these like very stupid decisions, and they suffer because of them. Then I am much more likely to sort of check that emotion and reduce it to a much lower extent. When I reduce it to that much lower extent, so that it like
You
it doesn't
are
cross the threshold to like sort of like violate the moral code of society, then I'm able to sort of utilize that. Then I'm able to look at envy without malice. Then I'm able to derive motivation from it. Before I proceed further, OG.
Does Christianity tell you envy is a sin, or that in a complex way, oh no, envy leads to this, which is
Fair
bad,
enough,
which
fair
is
enough,
why
fair
this
enough,
is
fair enough.
verified as?
Fair enough, fair enough, fair enough. Understand that even so, you as a rational person are not going to believe like literally every single thing, right? Which means that even if you are like a religious fanatic, you're going to sort of like take a step back and think, right? Because of the simple fact that you as an individual want to believe that you're a good person. And just because the Bible tells you that like this one particular thing is wrong, and for example, like Bible mentions like 10 instances of envious actions being bad, and like maybe one or two isolated instances of something or like some emotion being bad. Even so, like more emphasis on action, right? Our final argument then: existing power structures get worse on government. Simply put, existing power structures have this sort of like incentive to go ahead and divide and conquer, right? That is to say that they're more likely to it's to sort of like encourage people to be envious, right? They're more likely to encourage people to go ahead and like be jealous of their coworkers or be jealous of like whoever, right? So like this looks like employers sort of like focusing, or employers sort of telling their employees to be jealous of their coworkers. That way, they're just like interested in like sabotaging their own coworkers instead of realizing that our employer is actually exploiting us. We'll elaborate more on this in bit with that.
Thank you, member club session. Following up on the flip here.
Brench's extension takes around in three distinct ways. Firstly, he explains to you why it is that vilification will be internalized poorly and will thus be harmful. This is important, firstly, because opening government fails to prove this, but relies upon this mechanization for all of their harms to be true, and secondly, because it directly responds to the characterization of the opposition bench, which requires the idea that this norm is very nuanced and only goes after the extremes in order for any of their benefits to accrue. Secondly, Brench explains to you why the counterfactual would not be one where an unlimited amount of envy is accepted, but rather only where a moderate and useful amount of envy is accepted, which explains why none of the harms that opposition bench talk about would be able to accrue. Finally, he wins the debate for a third time by explaining why an inability to access that moderate level of envy is so harmful. The fact that it denies people access to an important source of motivation, the fact that it prevents important forms of social change, and the fact that it is when those feelings are allowed to fester, when they are unable to be discussed in common society, that people explode and the worst extremes of behavior occur. Let's start with opening opposition's case and explain why we beat it. Opening opposition's contention is that too much envy can sometimes lead to some negative consequences, and they describe examples. Things like maybe you engage in self-pity, maybe you become an incel, or maybe you engage in other forms of antisocial behavior that are undesirable. The problem is that this relies on their characterization that the vilification of envy is in fact not the vilification of envy, it's a targeted vilification of a set of peculiar downstream consequences of envy. Our extension defeats this in detail in three distinct ways. Firstly, Brench explains to you that the vilification of envy is not the targeted vilification of downstream consequences, but the vilification of the emotion itself, and he gives you good reason to believe this. Firstly, read the info slide. This debate is about a norm targeting the emotion of envy and not things unrelated or, tangentially related to envy. Secondly, that the construction of the norm is one that was constructed by the rich and powerful, and it makes most sense for them to want to construct the norm that closing government identifies and not the norm that opening opposition identifies, because they wanted to prevent people from comparing themselves to the wealthy, from noticing that the wealthy have taken things from them, from having conversations about the unfairness of the status quo. Brench also explains why they would have the control to be able to construct this narrative, because they control media, information, and have traditionally had substantially more control, which co-opts opening opposition's reasoning, which is that religion is controlled by the masses and therefore would have made the norm favorable to the masses. No, the church was not. It was under the control of priests and other powerful elites who have exactly the contrary incentive to that suggested by opening opposition, which explains why vilification will target the emotion itself, why vilification will be harmful, and why vilification will make people feel shame, which means opening opposition's benefit can accrue, but our harms do. Secondly, though, we explained that even if this is not true, there are already existing norms that deal with all the harms opening opposition identifies that might be downstream of envy. There are already norms against self-pity. There are already norms against being a creep or a weirdo or engaging in any of the antisocial behavior they engage in. Finally, we defeat this argument for a third time with our extension when we explain that the counterfactual would not be one of unlimited envy, but one where only a moderate amount of envy is allowed. For reasons that the kinds of people you talk about your feelings with are your friends, and that they have incentives to allow you to discuss these issues somewhat, but not infinitely, because there are already social norms around, for example, how much pity you're allowed to feel for yourself, how annoying you're allowed to be before your friends tell you to move on, and just the fact that social norms in general are constructed to be pro-social. So this defeats opening opposition's only benefit in the debate and explains why all of our harms take it over them. Let's then deal with closing opposition. The first note I'd make about their case is that it's extremely derivative and contingent on opening opposition, which is why we already defeat this for the reasons we get over opening opposition. But they make two new contributions. The first is the idea that maybe this norm is good because otherwise the poor would be jealous and envious of each other rather than of the rich, and that would be harmful. Two responses to this. The first response is that it seems far more likely that poor people would be envious of rich people because they have more stuff than poor people who tend to have very limited amount of stuff. But secondly, the fact that we explain that the construction of this norm was conducted by the rich suggests that they have a revealed preference to want no envy, which suggests that the counterfactual is not that they feel envious of other people. If that was the case, the rich would not need to construct this norm. The second novel contribution from closing opposition is they attempt an alternate mechanization of OO's claim, which is that this will only target extremes and not target regular forms of the behavior. All of the responses to OO also respond to this.
Why?
Their additional analysis is to say, well, you never vilify things that are normal, only things that are extreme. Contingent on the idea that envy is not perceived of as extreme in all circumstances. They say, well, envy is normal, therefore you wouldn't vilify it, but we explain the norm that the rich have constructed makes envy seem like it is an extreme emotion, an unbecoming emotion that you should never have, which is why it is never tolerated. That takes us over closing opposition. OO.
Yeah, narratives like fairness is what is pushing social movements. Envy makes these movements worse because they do not require a fair outcome, which likely manifests into violence against people you feel envy from. This is just an example for all other conversations that can happen around it.
Well, I have two questions for you, OO. Firstly, from where do you get the feeling of unfairness? We say it springs from envy. And secondly, who said that envy is not directed towards fairness? Why is it that you don't feel bad because it is undeserved and therefore a more fair allocation would be deserved? You just assert the fact that these are distinct when they are in fact related. Finally, let's address why it is that we take it over opening government. There are a couple of reasons. Firstly, opening government brings broadly two things to the debate. Firstly, they say, well, you can't control your experience of envy. And secondly, they say that envy could be useful and could engage for motivation or for various forms of critique. The problem with opening government's case is, firstly, they fail to mechanize key details in all of these arguments that Brench needs to fill in, which is why our mechanization is necessary for any of opening government's benefits to be achieved. We explain why it is that this narrative vilifies you in a way that makes you feel bad for something you cannot control. We explain why it denies you motivation or denies you social change. Opening government is unable to do this on their own. But secondly, opening government is unable to respond to challenges from the op bench that only we defeat. They don't explain why vilification isn't only targeted at bad downstream consequences, or why it is that there aren't alternate ways to achieve opening government's benefits, which is why we take the round very clearly.
And lastly, to close this debate, op with
20 seconds, I'm setting up a time. Am I audible and visible clearly?
Yep.
Cool. Stop going opit. I'll take POIs, definitely one from opening. I'll ask around the fifth. Put your POIs in the chat, don't unmute. And please also put your house along with the POI. That's it. Starting my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Before I do anything else, the most critical part of this debate that essentially government has tried to get away with is the fact that envy exists on a spectrum. This concerns both everyday envy and envy that's related to social issues. That's to say, there are milder forms of envy that you can express yourself with, and this is just plain intuition. Don't you fucking gossip about your friends when you feel like they have a Rolex and you don't? You obviously do. That's to say, there are multiple other avenues of you going ahead and expressing envy in a more moderate, milder way than simply it being black and white. That's to you going ahead and saying, tear down the fucking power structure or feel no envy at all. That's not how it functions. This is equally valid for political and social situations, in which case a milder form of envy probably goes ahead in terms of unfairness and says that, look, probably this power structure is something that's a problem, rather than you just going ahead and rioting on the street straight away. That's probably an extreme option. That's to say, simply, envy exists on a spectrum. And this entire framing that you get only from Aditya is enough to take down literally all of fucking government. But before that, but anyway, I'll go this way: CG, OG, then I'll compare to opening opposition, right? Understand some external responses to CG, because their case, if you think about it as an average voter, is just plain BS. Understand that they rely on two responses very frequently. They tell you to read the Infloslide, understand that the Infloslide can be interpreted, and more importantly, just think about it. How do you fucking hate an emotion? That's simply not possible. Intuitively, you don't hate love or you don't love love. You can't do that because these are subjective emotions that can't be fucking defined. And if you could define love, you'd probably be a fucking trillionaire, because you'd have the knowledge that absolutely all of the world is looking for. You can't define that emotions. It's subjective. It's different for literally every single person. You can't hate that emotion. Secondly, they go ahead and tell you that apparently the rich will construe this narrative in some sort of way that makes it that unfairness is not possible. Simply, like, again, gut check this. Don't you see cartoons? Don't you see media that goes ahead and depicts such as like Scrooge McDuck in Donald Duck? Don't you see envy and greed being depicted as an incorrect motion and an incorrect motive and an incorrect feeling there? And don't you see that being done in the form of actions rather than just going ahead and hating on the feeling? Understand then that if you just gut check and think about this on an intuitive level, CG is just pure bullshit. Moreover, thirdly, they go ahead and tell you that, look, your friends will tell you that you can't be any more annoying, and that's why the envy that you experience on their world will only be moderate. Understand this relies on the social code and the moral code that your friends follow, which in fact and in turn is defined by the exact narrative of social vilification that we're talking about. When we're talking about vilification of envy at a societal level, we're talking about that becoming part of the moral code. Again, this is implicit in literally every single speech in this debate. At the point that they tell you that, look, your friends won't tell you that you will be annoying, that's because of the fact that that moral code exists. In their world, the vilification of envy is not a part of the moral code. That's why your friends say absolutely nothing. Again, plain intuition, CG is pure bullshit. But they try to prove two things to you. Essentially, they go ahead and tell you that, look, some sort of social narrative control exists on the rich. I'll disprove this on three things. A, literally in their own first speech, they go ahead and tell you that a moderate level of envy still exists, in which case you can probably intuit that you probably still hate the rich because you have a feeling of moderate unfairness towards them. We don't understand why only hating the rich comes at the extreme end of the envy spectrum. In that case, just intuitively, you can feel that their argument is BS. But anyway, secondly, given envy is a spectrum, envy is experienced freely. That's to say, their benefit simply doesn't fucking accrue. Secondly, they go ahead and tell you that, look, people never acknowledge their envy and they go ahead and internalize it, in which case they don't show it. Understand, again, BS, because of the fact that you can still go ahead and gossip, you can still go ahead and opt for moderate forms of expressing your envy. That's probably not true. But even if I bite that bullet, you go ahead and say that, like, the impact that it brought over this becomes acceptable in society on their side of the house. Not internalizing envy and showing your envy. Understand that this goes across the spectrum. That's to say, they haven't given you a reason, given the fact that their idea of a social moral code and like friends stopping you doesn't work, that they've essentially gone ahead and made acceptable the most extreme forms of envy. That is to say, it's completely fine for you to go ahead and sabotage someone else's job in order to get their job out of envy. It's fair for you to take the most extreme actions in their world. That's a harm on them that they haven't dealt with. At that point in time, CG out of this debate. Let's look at OG. Understand the problem with OG is this. Their simple claim, all of their benefits, all of their impacts center around the fact that they want to tell you that you somehow can't express yourself within our paradigm. Understand that that's simply not true. Two reasons. And again, as I told you at the top of my speech, the framing of what envy is on a spectrum is extremely important here. Understand then that the difference and the gap in their mechanization is actions versus feelings. That's to say, their entire argument is based on you go ahead and internalizing stuff based on your feelings. That's to say, if the narrative of vilification was about feelings, all of their benefits would absolutely be true. But the thing is, as Aditya defines for you, as and you can probably, again, I'm using this word a lot because that's literally the response to all of government common sense. As you can intuit, that's not how envy is vilified, not taking a POI right now. At that point in time, understand that the vilification of envy, when it looks like the results of vilification of media, probably doesn't result in internalization ever, because you're told not to do murder, you're told not to sabotage somebody, not that you're wrong because you feel envious. That's where their comparison to LGBTQ people probably just is inaccurate. At that point in time, OG's claims, all of the impacts that they derive don't work. Their mech doesn't work. At that point in time, why do we take this debate over our opening? Understand that our opening talks and has benefits and impacts entirely contingent on the way you feel internally. That's while we achieve the exact same impacts in a better world and less crime, we do this by talking about actual actions. That's to say, when Aditya tells you that there is less amount of hate towards each other because of the moral code that exists and not of the way you internally feel, that's how we differentiate ourselves from our opening. Insofar as our mechanism is valid, and I think both government benches have done a lot in going ahead and answering opening opposition's mechanism. At that point in time, ours is the only exclusive mech that gets you a better world, gets you less actions that harm each other, and just gets you a more harmonious life. Thank you. Proud to win this debate. Vote CO.
Thank you, everyone, for what was a wonderful quarters.